Iran's parliament is moving to pass a law that would permanently alter who gets to use one of the most important waterways on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, through which a fifth of the world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas travels every year, is about to be placed under Iranian management in a way that has no precedent in the modern era. What that law says, what it means for the global economy, and what legal architecture it is prepared to shred in the process is what this video is about. Start with what the law actually contains.
Iran's Parliamentary National Security and Foreign Policy Committee has ratified a 12-article motion formally titled The Law on Establishing Iran's Sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. The legislation, if ratified by the full parliament, would allow Iran to charge tolls on ships passing through the strait for environmental and security services, and would contain terms on which types of vessels will be allowed through. The headline provisions have been stated publicly by senior Iranian lawmakers and are unambiguous. Israeli vessels will be permanently barred from the strait at any time. Vessels belonging to hostile countries would also be barred unless they first paid compensation for damage caused during the war. Every other ship would need to obtain a permit from Iranian authorities before entering the waterway. Ships passing through the strait must coordinate their passage with Iranian authorities and pay charges in Iranian rial for the services they receive. There is an additional provision that sounds almost bureaucratic until you consider its implications. The 12-article law would prohibit transit for countries and entities that avoid using Persian Gulf as the official name of the body of water in southern Iran in their shipping documents. Iran would also seize ships that disobey, confiscating a portion of their cargo. The revenue from these tolls has a designated allocation. 30% would go to strengthening military infrastructure, while 70% would go to economic development and public welfare. One Iranian lawmaker put it plainly: managing the Strait of Hormuz is more important than acquiring nuclear weapons, Rezai said. That statement is worth sitting with. The deputy speaker of Iran's parliament, Ali Niqzad, described what this represents in terms that leave little room for interpretation. He called it a fundamental shift in the management of one of the world's most important maritime passages, a strategic turning point in consolidating national sovereignty, and compared its importance to the nationalization of the oil industry, the 1951 moment when Iran seized control of its own petroleum resources from British hands. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf was more explicit, writing that by exercising management over the Strait of Hormuz, Iran would ensure that it and its neighbors enjoy a future free from the presence and interference of America.
Those are not the words of a government announcing a bureaucratic shipping regulation. Those are the words of a government that believes it has, through the course of this war, acquired a strategic asset it did not previously possess and intends to hold on to it. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. The strait carries around 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas supplies, making it one of the most critical choke points in the global economy. Shipping traffic has already collapsed. Only 40 vessels crossed the strait during the week ending May 3, 2026, compared with a pre-war average of around 120 crossings per day. Pre-conflict, around 3,000 vessels used the strait each month. Their numbers now stand at around 5% of that level. That collapse has already sent energy prices sharply higher. U.S. gasoline prices rose above $4.50 a gallon for the first time in 4 years. Nearly 20,000 seafarers aboard close to 1,000 vessels remain stuck in the Gulf amid the confrontation. These are not combatants. These are civilian workers trapped inside a geopolitical standoff. The question the legal community has been debating since Iran first closed the strait is whether it had the right to do any of this. The answer depends on which legal universe you are inhabiting, and the United States and Iran are operating from entirely different ones. When the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated, a critical deal was struck.
The convention accepted that coastal states can lawfully extend their territorial sea from the previously accepted limit of 3 nautical miles to 12. This placed some 138 additional straits that are less than 24 nautical miles wide under the jurisdiction of one or more coastal states. In exchange, those coastal states had to accept that a special legal regime would apply. They must accept an enhanced right of transit passage for shipping of all nations.
Part 3 of UNCLOS, particularly Articles 37 through 44, governing straits used for international navigation, holds that all ships and aircraft have a right of transit passage, which shall not be impeded, and that there shall be no suspension of transit passage through such a strait. The logic is explicit in the treaty's design. When global trade depends on a narrow corridor, the bordering states are not permitted to use that corridor as leverage. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 nautical miles wide, with its navigable inbound and outbound channels each only about 2 miles across, was built for exactly this framework.
But here is the complication that Iran has exploited from the beginning, and that the proposed law codifies permanently. Iran is not a party to UNCLOS, and it rejects this legal regime as binding customary law. In Iran's view, a regime of innocent passage applies in the strait, granting it, as a coastal state, broader authority to supervise traffic, impose conditions on passage, and even restrict it on security grounds. Iran reaffirmed this perspective upon signing UNCLOS in 1982. Tehran argues that because transit passage is tied up in the compromises made by UNCLOS, only countries that ratify the treaty can claim the right to transit passage, and neither the United States nor Iran has ratified it.
This is Iran's legal argument in its cleanest form. We did not sign the treaty. You did not sign the treaty. The transit passage regime does not bind us. What applies instead is the older, more limited right of innocent passage, a standard under which a coastal state has far more discretion to decide what counts as innocent and what does not. The United States correctly argues that transit passage has become accepted as a firm right of all states in international custom, also binding on non-parties. Most international legal scholars agree with Washington on this point. The argument that Iran's rejection of UNCLOS exempts it from the transit passage regime is weak, since there is little doubt that this rule of UNCLOS represents customary law, accepted as such by the overwhelming majority of the world's states.
But legal correctness and political reality are two different things, and the law Iran is now moving to pass takes this dispute from a wartime operational question into the realm of permanent, codified national law. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister for Legal and International Affairs stated publicly that we are now in a state of war, and wartime conditions cannot be governed by peacetime rules. If that framing were accepted, the consequences would extend well beyond Hormuz. It would imply that any bordering state engaged in armed conflict could suspend or reconfigure the legal regime of an international strait by unilateral fiat. The Strait of Malacca, Bab el-Mandeb, the Danish Straits, Gibraltar, all governed by the same underlying framework. A precedent set at Hormuz reaches all of them.
A fee regime premised on bordering state discretion to screen, price, and selectively deny passage would transform a legal right of passage into a purchased license. UNCLOS Article 26 is explicit. No charge may be levied upon foreign ships by reason only of their passage through the territorial sea. One legal scholar offered a historical parallel. The Danish sound dues, levied on vessels transiting the Øresund until 1857, were for centuries collected by Denmark. They were ultimately abolished only through collective payment by maritime powers. None of those conditions applies to Hormuz today. Iran's proposed tolls post-date the legal framework they contradict. The United States responded to Iran's closure not with diplomacy, but with a counter-blockade. On April 13, the U.S. launched a counter-blockade of the strait, targeting all ships seeking to reach Iranian ports. Iran has threatened military action if the blockade does not end. President Trump previously threatened extensive attacks on Iranian infrastructure if shipping does not resume. He also said that under the conditional ceasefire, Iran promised to open the strait
and knowingly failed to do so. Washington has warned that companies and governments paying Iranian-imposed tolls could face sanctions. In other words, the United States is threatening to sanction any entity that complies with Iranian law in Iranian territorial waters. That is a remarkable position. It means that a ship's captain attempting to follow Iranian procedures to pass through the strait would be committing a sanctionable offense under American law. The jurisdictional collision is total. The deeper concern for Western governments and shipping firms is not merely the disruption itself, but Iran's apparent effort to normalize authority over an international waterway. Matt Wright of marine intelligence firm Kepler warned that prolonged Iranian dominance over Hormuz would keep shipping flows well below normal levels, with major consequences for global oil and gas markets.
The international response has split predictably. The UK and France hosted 2 conferences on reopening Hormuz, with a focus on exploring potential sanctions, diplomatic initiatives, and insurance provision for ships. They signed a statement alongside 36 other countries expressing readiness to contribute to efforts to ensure safe passage and condemning attacks on commercial shipping. At the United Nations Security Council, the result was exactly what everyone expected. On April 7, China and Russia vetoed a draft resolution on the Strait of Hormuz. The Bahraini-drafted resolution called for an end to Iranian attacks and for states to coordinate efforts defensively for shipping access, including escorts for ships. China's veto requires its own examination. China is Iran's largest oil customer. A significant portion of the petroleum that China depends on for its industrial economy transits the Strait of Hormuz. On its face, a closed or restricted strait should be against China's interests, and Beijing has said publicly that freedom of navigation in the strait should be the shared call of the international community. Yet China vetoed the resolution that would have acted to restore it. The explanation is not complicated. China benefits enormously from a world in which the United States cannot enforce its preferred rules at sea. Every precedent that weakens American naval supremacy, every legal architecture that splinters away from the Washington Consensus, these are gains for Beijing, regardless of their short-term economic cost. A China that pays slightly more for oil in exchange for a world where Iran successfully rewrites maritime law is making a trade it will take.
Russia's calculus is simpler. The disruption to the strait has pushed up global oil and gas prices, benefiting Russia. Moscow watches the strait stay closed and watches its own oil revenues rise. There is nothing to veto on its behalf. The ceasefire negotiations being mediated by Pakistan have made the strait's status a central and unresolved issue. Iran's 5-point counterproposal included an end to U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran and pro-Iranian forces in Lebanon and Iraq, security guarantees to prevent future aggression, war reparations, and international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. That last demand, international recognition of sovereignty over the strait, is what the entire legal battle is about. Iran is not asking for a temporary accommodation. It is asking for a permanent restructuring of who controls one of the most consequential shipping corridors on the planet, backed by law, backed by precedent, backed by the international community's signature.
The United States, for its part, has offered shifting and often contradictory positions. Trump said the war would be brief. Then he said it would go further. Then he offered a 2-month ceasefire. Iran rejected it and countered with a demand for resolution within 30 days. Iran submitted a 14-point response through a Pakistani intermediary, calling for ending the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. Iran believed that issues should be resolved within 30 days, and that negotiations should focus on termination of the war rather than extending a ceasefire. Trump reviewed the plan and said he could not imagine it would be acceptable. Meanwhile, the strait remains effectively closed. Almost no shipping has used the strait. The U.S. has imposed a counter-blockade on ships seeking to use Iranian ports, and Iran's parliament is moving toward codifying its wartime control into permanent domestic law, which would then stand as the legal baseline for any future negotiation. Here is the underlying strategic logic that the legal debate tends to obscure. Iran entered this war as the weaker party by almost every conventional military metric. Its supreme leader was killed in the opening hours. Its nuclear sites were struck. Its senior military and political leadership was decimated. Its regional proxies have been degraded over the preceding 2 years of conflict. By the traditional measures of war, Iran lost, or at minimum, did not win. And yet, Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. A country with a relatively modest navy, badly crippled by the largest American military operation in decades, closed off a fifth of the world's oil supply and has maintained that closure through a combination of mines, drones, missiles, and the willingness to fire on commercial shipping. The head of the International Energy Agency described the crisis as more serious than the disruptions of 1973, 1979, and 2022 combined. Trump himself told people privately that he had marveled at how a guy with a drone could shut down the strait. That admission is more revealing than any public statement he has made about the war. Iran understands what it has. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, described the strait as a strategic asset and outlined a vision for the region's future as a future without America, emphasizing the importance of Iranian management of the strait. That framing, the strait as the vehicle through which American influence in the Persian Gulf can be permanently reduced, is not rhetorical flourish. It is a statement of strategic doctrine from the person who now controls the country.
The proposed law is the codification of that doctrine. Iranian naval forces fired missiles and drones near U.S. destroyers that ignored repeated warnings to stay away, and officials have vowed to use force against any further attempts to break their hold on the waterway. Iran has also created institutional infrastructure to administer its new regime. Iran's authorities announced the establishment of the Administration for the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, responsible for issuing shipping licenses. The bureaucratic machinery of a permanent toll regime is being built while the law authorizing it moves through parliament. What the U.S. is confronting is not a temporary wartime measure. It is the construction of a new legal and administrative order at one of the most strategically vital points on Earth, undertaken by a government that has concluded, not without reason, that military defeat and strategic victory are not mutually exclusive. The abrupt launch and suspension of the U.S. naval escort mission, known as Project Freedom, has highlighted the difficulty of restoring free navigation without risking wider escalation. The United States has the military capacity to force the strait open. It does not clearly have the political will to absorb what that would cost. Every ship the U.S. escorts through the strait under fire, every Iranian drone that strikes a destroyer, every tanker that burns in the Gulf of Oman, these are escalatory steps toward a war whose duration and endpoint no one in the Trump administration has been willing to define.
The Strait of Malacca, Bab el-Mandeb, the Danish Straits, and Gibraltar are all strategically significant waterways governed by the same underlying straits framework, a precedent that permits a belligerent littoral state to impose tolls, discriminatory access conditions, or bilateral clearance schemes during armed conflict would alter the legal architecture on which maritime commerce, naval mobility, and third state reliance depend. The states that should be most alarmed by this precedent are not the United States and Israel, who are party to the conflict. They are the neutral states, Japan, South Korea, India, every country in Southeast Asia, whose economies depend on unimpeded access to Persian Gulf energy, and who now face a world where that access is subject to Iranian approval. Iran's deputy foreign minister said wartime conditions cannot be governed by peacetime rules. The legal scholars who have analyzed this position note that accepting it would mean any state at war could rewrite the rules of the sea to suit its military posture. But there is a harder truth underneath that observation. Rules are only rules when someone enforces them. The United Nations Security Council, the body tasked with enforcing international order, produced a vetoed resolution. The maritime law community has produced detailed and largely correct legal analysis, concluding that Iran is overstepping its rights. None of that analysis moves a single tanker through the strait.
What moves tankers through the strait is either Iranian permission or American firepower. Right now, Iranian permission comes with conditions that are about to be encoded into law. And American firepower comes with a president who is simultaneously threatening to obliterate Iranian civilization and saying the war will be a short-term excursion, who declared victory while the strait was closed,
and who has been told by his own intelligence agencies that his primary war objective was not achievable before a single bomb was dropped. The law Iran's parliament is passing is not the cause of this situation. It is the consequence of it. When you launch a war to achieve regime change and topple a supreme leader, and the regime continues, and the successor hardens the government's posture, and the strait stays closed, and a new legal order is being constructed in the waterway you need to reopen, you have produced a strategic outcome that is in almost every respect the opposite of what you set out to achieve. The law formalizes that outcome. It converts a wartime improvisation into a permanent institutional claim, and it does so at the moment when the United States has the least diplomatic leverage to stop it, because it is simultaneously blockading Iranian ports, threatening further strikes, and trying to negotiate a deal its president publicly called unacceptable. Iran compared this moment to the 1951 nationalization of its oil industry. That comparison is not frivolous. Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil in 1951. 2 years later, the CIA and British intelligence removed him in a coup and restored the Shah. The lesson Iran drew from 1951 was not that nationalization was wrong. The lesson was that nationalization without sufficient power to defend it is temporary. Iran in 2026 is attempting to establish permanent control over the strait from a position of demonstrated military capability. Wounded, yes, but capable of closing the most important oil choke point in the world with drones and determination. Whether it succeeds depends on negotiations whose outcome is genuinely unclear. But the law moving through Iran's parliament is a statement of intent that will outlast any ceasefire. It says, this waterway is ours to manage. You will pay to pass. Some of you will not pass at all. And this is not a wartime emergency measure. This is the new legal baseline from which all future conversations begin. The global shipping industry is watching. The energy markets are watching. Every government whose economy depends on Persian Gulf oil is watching. And what they are watching is a country that lost the opening phase of a war deciding, with considerable legal creativity and demonstrated military will, that losing a battle is not the same as losing control of the sea.